This ad-free episode is made possible through the financial support of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon community. We're taking a stand against the ugly and aesthetically offensive advertising that has taken over media platforms like this one. If you're sick of giving your money to corporations just for the privilege of not having your experience constantly interrupted by these ugly and offensive ads, then consider supporting this podcast creator directly by becoming a Howl in the Wilderness Patreon member. For the cost of a cup of coffee or a bag of dog treats once a month, you can gain access to early release of all episodes, bonus episodes, the full podcast archives, and soul salons where we get together and we discuss the topics that we talk about on this podcast. Visit patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness to find out more. Thanks for listening. I'm going to try your full name, see how I do.
Okay.
Okay. Enrique Martinez Celaya, welcome to the podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're here on the occasion of the publishing of a new book that you've co-authored with James Hollis, who's been on the podcast before. It's called Tending the Fire, Creativity, Purpose, and the Unfolding Self. And it's in the form of a series of dialogues that you've had with Dr. Hollis on some of the big questions of life. And I'm curious if we could just begin by talking about the genesis of the book. Like, how did you meet James Hollis? What had he meant to you at that time? And how did you get the book going?
I've learned about Jim many years ago when I read his book, The Middle Passage, which was very important to me at the time that it came into my life. So I remain interested in his work. I read a lot of his other books, and I have done some work with the Jungian Institute. And when he came to speak at the Jungian Institute, I asked to meet him, and we met when I was arriving in a plane and he was leaving that same day, and we met by a fire pit in some hotel, which I can't remember what hotel it was. And immediately we hit it off and we made a connection, and we remained in touch for many years. So this must have been maybe 10 years ago, something like that. And we always talked about a collaboration of some sort. And I brought up this idea, why don't we do a book about ideas, about questions, and then we both contributed questions, and we set out to answer it. Originally, we thought that each of us will answer the question independently and then comment on each other's answers. But when we saw our answers to the questions, we felt that there was no need to go back and review or comment on each other's work, that there was so much connection already between it that it was not necessary to do anything else.
And you've been a working artist, a painter, for much of your life. If people are watching the video, they can see that in your background, there's one of your paintings there. It's very beautiful. And I love that this is a dialogue between a depth psychologist and an artist. I think, would you agree that that artists are naturally depth psychological?
I think so. I mean, I think there is a constant exploration and questioning. There's also an aspect of trying to move beyond the superficial image to find a resonant image, and that resonance depends on some in-depth reflection and investigation. And I think Jim and I also share the fact that he was an academic before in literature and philosophy, and I was a physicist before. So we both came from different careers, and philosophy and literature also connects us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's an aspect of your story that I could relate to quite a bit. I had a first career as a graphic designer, and then I had my own midlife passage and started to listen to the calling to live a different life, to do different kind of work. Um, and I'd love for you, because it's one of the questions that you bring up in the book, the idea of vocation and what it means to follow a vocation. I wonder if you could describe to people how you recognized the calling to become an artist. How did it come to you?
Um, so I'm an immigrant. I was born in Cuba, moved to Spain and Puerto Rico, um, and I have been an apprentice for a painter. I have always been writing and painting since I was, very young, and became an apprentice at 11. And did it seriously, and it meant a lot to me, and certainly meant a lot to me as a way to understand my life. I felt that I couldn't make sense of what was around me, and I needed art and writing and reading to try to hold on to it. But as an immigrant, first son to the whole family, I always thought I should do something other than art. I mean, art was not even a consideration. And I was good in math and science, and I love physics, and I like to understand the idea of truth in some manner. So I went to college and grad school to do physics. I was doing a PhD in laser physics. But the whole time I was painting and kind of keeping it to kind of to the side, not just, acknowledging that it was in my life, but as a hobby. And when I finished all my doctoral exams and I was working on my thesis, I knew enough about what my life would be like as a physicist to know that I enjoy it, but it wasn't calling me, to use the word that you use. And I realized that I was painting all the time, and that's what I wanted to do. So I went to a lighthouse in Northern California and sequestered myself there for 5 days, writing and walking the beach and thinking. And at the end of that, I decided that I wanted to be an artist full time, even though I had no idea what that actually meant. I just I just had this desire. I had nothing to show for. I had a lot to show for in physics, nothing to show for in art except that I wanted to do it. And and that's how it happened. It was in some ways terrifying, and in some ways a disappointment to everyone, to an extent to myself. But it was something that felt inevitable, that I couldn't avoid it. And I think in some ways that was the beginning of a different way of growing up for me.
Hey. Are you familiar with James Hillman and his Soul's Code book that talks about the acorn theory and ideas around the daimon and your destiny?
I'm not, but I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah. Well, he relates an old Platonic myth, or a myth actually that's older than Plato, that Plato told. And it has to do with how our soul comes into this life with an idea of its purpose and destiny and is given its lot in life. And, when it comes into this incarnation, we forget everything. We forget all of that purpose and destiny. And we're assigned a daimon that guides us along our true path. And so the idea is that you have to learn how to listen to your daimon if you want to live your authentic life. And I'm just struck by the fact that you entered an apprenticeship with a painter when you were 11 years old. I mean, how does that happen? Did you grow up in a family of artists, or who recognized this acorn starting to show itself at so young an age?
No, I didn't grow up in a family of artists. In fact, most of my interests were strange to my family. My interest in reading, my interest in art. My mother came from a family of doctors and dentists, and my father um, didn't have anything like that in his life. But I had a passion for it since I was a little kid. I think I still have the letters that I sent to my father when he was living in Spain, and they're full of drawings trying to explain what was happening in our lives. That was when I was 6. So by 9 or 10, I was trying to make paintings that uh, look like what I imagine Renaissance paintings look like. They were nothing like it. They were, but they were my version of it.
Hey.
And there was a painter that lived across where my parents have their shop, and I reached out to him to start working with him and helping him in exchange for lessons. And uh, it was, it was. It didn't fit into the rest of my life in many ways. That kind of private engagement with someone that was much older than me. I was restless in other ways. Um, so it was a sort of a great experience. And in many ways, his love for the work remains with me. Since something sometimes you can learn, look and lose through education, but his love for the work was so strong and so clear that influenced me at the right time. So I've been doing this now 50 years. It's my longest relationship.
Yeah, yeah, it's like that for me with music. It just it's been there longer than anything else. It's one of those threads that you and James ponder about, the threads that run all the way through our life. And music and what it's meant to me is just it's kind of like the center thread. It feels like it's always there, and it's always meaningful. Um, it must have been quite magical for you at 11 to enter into this painter's studio. Like I'm just imagining the oil paints and the the linseed oil or whatever is in there, and having someone who's engaged in this craft that you didn't have otherwise exposure to. I mean, what was that like for you?
Magical is the right word to use. I remember walking in and the smell of the studio um, being so incredible to me. And, I could sit forever watching him paint. I still can do that. I can still watch somebody work, and um, it's one of the most captivating things for me. Just watch how something appears to somebody's hand and how they move their hands over their work, and look at the boxes of pastels in the corner, and look at how he had lit up his studio. And his whole life, he was not a very successful artist. He survived by commissions and so on. But art was completely weaved into his entire life. So when you look at the couch, there were sketchbooks there. And when you look in the other corner, there were all works piled onto the corner. And I felt like I was transported to a different universe in some manner. And I felt very much alive there. When I was there, he taught me all the basic things of making pigments, stretching canvases, laying grounds, how to properly draw with charcoal. And he was very firm and at the same time very gentle in those lessons. And I'm incredibly grateful. It was not only an education in art making, it was an education in how to live, right? Which I certainly welcomed.
And an example of how you could like live an alternative life, which I think is so important for us as young people to be exposed to, beyond our own immediate family, to have exposure to other ways of living.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But the story about what life was like for my family and the people around me was very conventional life. The conventional idea of success or what a man of good, as it was often said, looked like. Um, and especially when you come through the difficult things of migration, quite often the ideas of what a good life is like is quite conventional, a successful conventional life. So to have an opportunity to see somebody rejoice and be madly in love for 4 hours over a painting and live for in an environment where there are paintings on the walls and the activity of bringing something about with meaning was all that mattered. To me, it was spectacular. And he was somewhat of a character also, which added another wonderful dimension, the idea of conventionality, the standard idea of that I had of what a successful adult or something was very different than.
Yeah. Yeah. In the book, you talk about, some of the pitfalls of following your vocation or living out your authentic life. And it's another thing I could relate to when you say that you had to kind of accept that other people at times found you to be a difficult person. And when I talk to people about authenticity, or when I listen to them speak about authenticity, I often feel that the underlying fantasy is that authenticity means that somehow I'll be expressing more of this a kind of a higher self, one that doesn't have so many eccentricities, where all my kind of personality traits have been ironed out. And I like where you came to in that it is really about accepting who you are with, I don't want to call them faults, but just your your own unique character, which could be quite eccentric, like your painting mentor. How do you feel about that
Yeah.
whole question of authenticity?
I mean, it has been central to my life. I remember encountering for the first time, when I was reading Hessa in my teenage years, and the idea of authenticity and what it meant. I don't remember anyone talking about it in my circle or church at the beginning of my life. I was used to go to church. Um, in fact, my problem with a lot of the things that I saw, particularly in going to church on Sundays, was what I didn't have a name for it, but it was inauthenticity, an inauthentic life. So for me, it became very important to say, well, what is authenticity? What does it mean to live an authentic life? And what does that look like for me? And what do I have to confront and integrate and evaluate and investigate and live? And that created a program for me. Program, maybe it's not the right word, but a certain imperative that of confrontation and settling in and discovering and acceptance that have shaped how I move through the world. And the question of difficulty you talk about, which is not not because I'm not kind. I try to be, but because sometimes being who you are puts you in an uncomfortable situation, relationship to a group or to someone else, and sometimes remaining true to that what you are is requires having certain boundaries that people will interpret as difficult. But yeah, the question of authenticity is central to me today. I mean, because as you know, it's not a point of arrival, but rather it's a mechanism of revelation So I'm constantly in the process of discovering how inauthentic some of my gestures and thoughts are. And art making is certainly, very, very revealing mirror in the question of authenticity. Art is one of those things that shows you, if you're willing to see, how far you are from your own ideas of authenticity. You find yourself, avoiding things, so you find yourself um, uh, not being honest enough with things.
Mm. Like when you were a boy and trying to be a Renaissance painter, when you weren't meant to be a Renaissance painter, I guess that would be what, like, I don't know, highly figurative realism, that kind of thing, where it's a lot about technique, I guess. And it just from, what I've seen on your website and the painting behind you, it seems like your style is a lot more impressionistic than the typical Renaissance painters. So to pursue that because of some ideal that they're the greatest painters, the most accomplished, that would have been the inauthentic path for you, I suppose.
Yeah, but inauthenticity shows up in more subtle ways. For example, we can begin to believe our story, or the paintings I have made creates a sense of this is who I am. When the truth of the matter is, this is who I am is always revealed in the present. And as an artist, you go through this process of discovery and unfolding, and you get a particular voice, and you become familiar with that voice. And at a certain point, the familiarity of that voice, of that way of working, becomes a trap, becomes a comfortable, familiar place. And then in some ways, the work has died when that happens. But we keep working on that. So that may seem authentic because, oh, this is what I am. But in fact, it's inauthentic because the energy, the revelation, the confrontation is no longer there. Now it's just, it's just the remnants and traces of a history when that actually was viable and true. And in some ways, the same is true in life. I mean, all of us can get too comfortable with our story. We thought we were rebels once, and we think we're still rebels when we're quite complacent. So I think authenticity, to me, is not what something, a state of being, but rather an attitude towards self-realization and self-confrontation. So I keep a line over all my studios, which is a Buddhist idea: keep your actions faithful. And that, to me, is the idea of authenticity, that what you say and what you do and what you think are faithful to one another. And that they are obligated only by certain idea about what truth is for you, rather than what already has been done, or what people know you to be, or what you know yourself to be.
Yeah, and I can imagine for a professional artist, it would be even more difficult to stay authentic or faithful to that unfolding process, because if you found success with a particular series or a certain style, you would have like extra pressure to keep replicating that or stay in that particular mode. And I've heard that from friends who are artists, that when they feel like a big kind of change happening in the way they're making their art, that this is often one of the things that they rub up against, the expectations of the public or the gallery. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that is a so the trap is not only one's interior trap, but it's an external trap as well. So my work looks very different. So if you look in the website, I might create, like right now, there's a installation in a museum that is a hybrid creation of my childhood home made out of sugar, and it's a big installation. And I make paintings, and I make sculptures, um, and each new beginning, each new body of work, I want to kind of reinvent myself, sort of as a beginner again. And I trust that there is a continuity to the work that is revealed and will be interesting to collectors or museums or whatever. But I have done a decent job of avoiding that trap, which is very common. And I think I think most people are aware of that trap, that dealers or collectors or everyone thinks, well, we like the work that you did, do more of it. And there's a great safety on it. But that's an easy one to recognize. The external pressure that wants you to make those paintings that were very successful in the last exhibition. That's a familiar pressure. It's mythologized through a lot of stories and movies and whatever. But the one that I think is more insidious and more difficult to recognize is one's on fear of venturing to new territory. I think that's the one that, in my experience, entraps more artists than the external one. That's the one that you feel that you have something that you can trust, something that you know how it will land in the world, and that venture into new territories, you just don't have the energy for that kind of reinvention. Especially because it might go south, it might go in the wrong direction. You might do something terrible, which is always a possibility.
Yeah. I mean, especially working at the kind of scale that you work at, every canvas, there's that possibility that it's going to be a total artistic failure.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think this from what you do and music. I think if you're not willing to risk that failure, then you're not really doing anything very interesting. If you have to stay away from that line where you can actually destroy what you're making and be a complete flop, which often happens. I paint my paintings again and again and again, and they're entire weeks that I feel like I got nothing going on. So, but I think that risk has always to have to be present, and of course, when you do make something that then convinces you to be meaningful, it's wonderful. Partly because you have existed in the dread of the edge of the cliff the entire time.
Yeah, and then you're kind of saved or something. An angel. You make the leap of faith, and an angel is there to catch you, or you find that you've got your own wings to soar.
Yeah, very much, very much. Yeah.
What is your own personal sense of what it is that you're being faithful to? Like the way I conceptualize it, I like this image of the diamond. That just that works for me. It feels like it's a kind of a good enough image to work with, where it's not within me, and I like that part of it. That there's something else that's prodding me along. For you, what's your sense of that? I mean, because a Buddhist would say like there's no self. Diamond, what are you talking about? I don't know. So how do you think of that, if you do?
Yeah, no, it's a very profound question, and I have reflected upon it. So I think there is a true self in oneself, and we can go into that a little bit more, but and that is at the core of that. There's a certain truth that is somewhat inhuman, that one recognizes in that true self, and that is when one is faithful for. Um, the, the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset speaks about the process of making our work, and this can give us a sense of what I mean. He says, when you start an artwork, you start as a human with your, psychology and your everyday concerns, and those influence the kind of imagery and the kinds of choices you make. And if that's where the painting is left, then the painting is not very good. It's just a confession. But if through the process of making, you cook off that human towards something transcendent, that transcendent is inhuman. That is the process of art making. So when I think of that faithfulness, I think, invoking something more fundamental, more still within myself, that is aware of truth, and to say something. And that is what I mean. That is what I mean there. And I realize that what I'm saying is very vague and not very clear. But
well, let's stick with it, because it does resonate with Hillman's idea of the acorn, that there is an image inside of us. Is one way to think about it. Like there's an image of the oak tree inside of the acorn. And it also resonates with your idea that authenticity is something that continually unfolds. It's a process that maybe only ends at death. Who knows? But like an oak tree is never done growing or changing, throughout its different seasons of its lifetime. I'm struck by Ortega's idea of it's not done until you cook off the human part of it. And the way I'm thinking of it is that when you begin a piece of art, whether it's a music composition or improvisation or a painting or a sculpture, that there already exists an image of the final piece. And at first, when you start to work on it, there's going to be too much of the personal involved there. It's going to be your own preferences and tastes that are shaping it or misshaping it. And so to keep going until that image is revealed, which has this like numinous quality to it, like where the artist, tell me if this is your experience, but you might actually be or should be surprised by where it ends up. Like it's not something that you could have conceived of, but it's something that you discover through this cooking off all of the personal human stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, if I understand how a painting works and where it comes from, I paint it over, always. The process of painting is a process of revelation and discovery. And people use the word express to describe the process of art making, but that's not the way I think of it.
Right. I express myself through my art.
Right, exactly. And to me, that already assumes that there is a pre-existing condition that I'm going to bring forth into the painting. The process of art making for me is a process of discovering what is there. There's no pre-existing anything. It's a relationship that reveals something that didn't exist before. And in that revelation, it has to be something that ends up where you didn't know you were going. And there's a sense of clarity that comes with that process, and surprise that comes with that process, and sometimes humbling that comes with that process. Like if you and I stand in front of one of my paintings, I can say that it's not very good, or I can say it is very good as if it wasn't mine, because I feel that which brought it about was mostly not me. Something I started it and I brought all whatever in it. But if a painting is going to arrive somewhere, there's all kinds of things that are very difficult to explain. Even intuition by itself is difficult to explain, but there are much more than intuition at play.
Mm-hmm. And so you don't start out, or if you start out with something pre-existing, and I'm guessing a pre-existing idea or image in your mind that you're trying to then execute on the page or the canvas or whatever, that is a kind of, that's the wrong way to go. But the way you're describing it, it sounds to me like there is something pre-existing, but maybe it's beyond our own consciousness. And your task is to try to be true to that, which the art wants to be. And so would you say like your critique of your art is more about your own failure to help that thing be realized rather than your ability to execute this pre-existing idea or image?
Like imagine if we're having this conversation, the podcast, going into it, I have no idea how this is going to unfold. I have some sense of who I am. I am getting to know you. And that's pretty much all I need, and then you contribute your part, I contribute my part, something unfolds, and our conversation is taken in places that I could not have predicted when I started that it was going to start. So what is unfolding between us is we're here trying to find and sort of give form to something that didn't exist before in you or in me. It's like a new thing coming to being. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same thing with an artwork. An artwork is really a dialogue, a conversation, a very intimate one, where you begin the work by leading the conversation. And as the process evolves, you are really mostly the follower of the conversation. And what's in front of you is showing you the way. And what is showing you the way is opening a path towards something that didn't exist in you beforehand and didn't exist in the painting and is coming to be, but is pointing to something that is always there. That's sort of fundamental truth in all things. So in some ways, I tend to look at all our works as the same thing, no matter what superficially they look like. If a work is a profound, transcendent work, it's always pointing, always bringing about the same state of being. And that is what each artist finds their own way by their own time that they lived in, their own circumstances. We all have to find a way through our path. But the ending place is always the same one.
What is that state of being? I'm thinking that it's, a great piece of art or a successful piece of art is something that evokes that sense of the numinous, of the timeless, of the intangible, unquantifiable truth, but truth in a way that's not measurable, that it's a felt thing. Like this is true in the way that a wheel is true. It's like the spokes are lined up with the hub in just the perfect way. It's just something like clicks, and you're struck by it, and you have that aesthetic response of, and it could be a painting of flowers or a sculpture of, David or whatever. But it's just, yeah, it's so hard to talk about, right? It's like talking about art is like dancing about architecture, something like that. I think that was David Byrne, maybe.
It is. It's hard to talk about it. I mean, Melville in Moby Dick speaks about Pip, the cabin boy that has fallen, and he says, and he saw the God's foot upon the treadle of the loom, and that's a beautiful image. And I think that in in some ways, that's what you see. You see God's foot upon the treadle of the loom, weaving all that there is. And I think the reason why words only can circle around it, but can really get in there is because it resists words. It's beyond words. It's much larger than words, and underneath all the things that words point to. That's what I love poetry in particular, because I think poetry tries to use words in some ways with themselves and against themselves to try to get to this place. And so when you see it, that's why for me the idea of what art is that. And if it's not that, then it's just an art activity. Like if I just make a painting, I haven't made any art. I just made a painting with a lot of paint, but it hasn't done that. It hasn't reached that place. And that's the only place that seems to matter to me. So it comes back to your question earlier on of the desires of dealers or galleries or pressures of what I have done before is irrelevant to that.
Right.
Right? There's nothing to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. When the standard is obtaining a glimpse of God's foot on the treadle of the loom of creation, then, if the gallery doesn't like, the new color palette of your series, it's like, okay, I'll find someone else who gets it.
Right. Right. And in that there's survival too. Like as you spoke about your calling early on, when you respond to what you feel is your calling, survival of yourself, survival of that calling depends on being in that journey, regardless of what superficial consequences they are, because everything becomes meaningless the moment you begin to sacrifice that pursuit for something else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's what I found. I mean, I made some big sacrifices to change my life. I was making a lot of money and getting a lot of recognition for my work and things like that. And to give it all up because I felt that my life needed to move in a different direction. It's been, financially difficult to make that transition at middle age. But I've never, one of the things that I would say, when I was experiencing a hard time would be that, I'm the poorest I've ever been, but I've never felt more rich. Because when I felt like I was being true to my destiny or my daimon, there was just something about it that was fulfilling and satisfying on such a deep, fundamental level that everything else became more or less consequential or less important as a consideration in determining, what the next step is. Is it, have you had like periods of difficulty after making this change? I mean, I can't imagine what it takes to establish yourself as an artist, where that is your primary way of earning income and making your way in the world.
Oh, it was very difficult. When I first left the PhD program, I was at Berkeley. It was a prestigious department. So the prestige is the first thing to give up. And I worked as a scientist for a bit, but then I lived in Oakland, selling my work in the parks of San Francisco, which is a tremendous exercise in humility because people walk by, make fun of your work, do all that. And I would, I felt that I was a dreamer, that I had nothing to show for. Many of my friends were going on to successful positions. My family thought that I have just given up all my potential. So it's not only the financial sacrifice, which was terrible, but it's a sense of everything that defines your identity as an intelligent, successful sort of person. Now you have nothing to show for. And when you tell people you're an artist, it's like it really doesn't count for a lot. You
Right.
get
It's like you're a bum.
you're like, people explain to you percentages because they feel that you're the dumbest person and that you're like silly and sort of. So for me, it was a complete losing of all that I have defined myself to be. And that was tough. And then, of course, the financial things are terrible. The constant rejection by the same people, people will, you open yourself in a way that you don't always open yourself in a regular job to constant opinions of other people telling you what you're doing is terrible.
Yeah.
And it goes from there. So it definitely was an uphill battle. And because I made it the choices I made, despite having what is called a successful career, there's still very difficult moments, moments that my unwillingness to make certain compromises made my life a lot more difficult. And at the same time, simpler, which I think you probably relate to, is more difficult in the logistics of it. It's simpler because my values and principles, I don't have to compromise them. I don't have to feel like, what was the lie that I told yesterday? Kind of question.
Yeah. And one of the questions that you guys do discuss in the book is, how do we make decisions? And I think this is the simplicity that you're talking about. Like for me, when I'm feeling that daimonic urging or the push to step into some new territory, to take a kind of, what could seem to be a risk, to my persona or, my income or whatever it is, at this stage for me, it's not much of a decision actually. And so in that way, my life is simpler, but making these risky moves can complexify or complicate my life, So yeah, it's that paradox of on one level, it's simple because I really have no other choice. I got to stay true to my destiny or my authenticity, whatever. But yeah, that might go against the grain of conventional expectations. And that's just the way it is. That's the curse and the blessing, right?
It is the curse and a blessing. Like you said, it's on the one hand very, very simple, and it's going to bring hell and complexity by that very choice. And I think, as you know, many people in the world made the exact opposite decision. They made very complex and flexible moral and internal decisions in order to keep a simple outward life. And they keep making more and more and more complex choices in contradiction to one another, because that allows life to be simple in the outside. But your soul or your heart end up become so twisted by the complexity of the decision web that you have inside yourself, that the question of authenticity is no longer even possible unless you do a radical change.
To watch or listen to the full episode, become a free or paid member by visiting patreon.com/Howl in the Wilderness, or by downloading the Patreon app to your mobile device. Paid memberships start at just $5 a month and offer a number of benefits, including early access to all episodes, the full podcast archives, and the satisfaction of knowing that you're supporting an independent creator directly. Thanks.